Welcome to the Cyber Cognition Podcast, a show that seeks to understand the future and the increasingly complicated relationship between society and technology. Explore the worlds of cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, transhumanism, robotics, and other fascinating topics at the frontiers of science and discovery, with your hosts, Hutch and Len.
So as of late, we have seen a lot of different interesting issues at the intersection of law and technology, specifically at the frontier of technology, and really specifically artificial intelligence. There are currently all kinds of different lawsuits coming out against all of your different large language model service providers, OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, across the board. We're seeing the same thing in digital media as well. So Suno is currently dealing with lawsuits from music generation, Midjourney, Stability AI. All of the image generator systems are also being sued for violating copyright infringement. And I think to bring everything to a head, we just recently saw a report coming out of the Atlantic that demonstrated the true scale of just how much of this so-called copyright infringement is going on. They released a database that allows anybody to query the library Genesis library that was used to train Meta's latest models, and presumably, based on the reporting, all of your different frontier language models. And it was everything from of course, my book, Lynn's book, pretty much everybody that I know in the cybersecurity space, their book was included in there as well.
Wynn's wasn't. Believe it or not, Wynn Schwartau's Art of the Meta War, somehow he was able to protect his, which is really awesome. Shout out to Wynn.
In any case, I mean, a huge impact, and I think showed to all of us just the level of scale here. And I think since then, we have seen kind of these armchair legal experts. Everybody is suddenly an expert at law and is opining on the implications related to copyright, related to fair use, which is the common defense for a lot of these training processes. And so, of course, myself and Lynn were somewhat in that camp as well of armchair legal experts, and definitely have opinions here. And I think we try to come as informed as possible whenever we have discussions about this. But the truth is, neither one of us have that true legal background. So I thought it would be interesting to bring on somebody that exists at the intersection of law as well as technology. And so Kyle is a person that I know well. I've worked with him for a while in a professional capacity. Very intelligent guy, very well spoken, very thoughtful about the conversations that he has and what he puts forward. But most importantly, he has his education background is initially in law, and then has ultimately moved over to work in technology, and so has kind of a unique perspective in terms of the intersection of the two.
I find this crazy because if you look back on just what people have said over the years, the running joke is there's two ways to get into cyber. One is to go to college, spend a lot of money, get a computer science degree. The other is to become a criminal. You can see the differences here because in the routes that Hutch took and I took, I've never heard somebody go from legal to cyber before. So this is a whole new thing, and I think it's one of the most unique cases of getting into this space that I've ever heard of.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kyle, welcome. Really excited to have you. I'd love to start with kind of understanding your journey of that movement from your background in law to how you ended up in technology and specifically in cybersecurity, and what that journey looks like. So if you don't mind, if I missed anything in the introduction, fill us in. Otherwise, let us know what that journey looks like.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite color is blue. That's about all you missed.
Oh, red.
All right, yeah. I mean, you did your due diligence there, Hutch. No, I appreciate it. But no, thanks for having me here. Excited to kind of talk about this topic. We've talked about it a few times. I think it's pretty interesting. Far more interesting probably than my background. But I, I've like kind of worked in IT forever. I'm old enough to have kind of seen the inception of kind of the modern computer. I was 10 years old or so building PCs and getting used parts and scraping stuff together. And
Computer shows?
Yeah, I loved computer shows, man. I went to the Fairplex here in Southern California. I was scouring everything, pick up my shareware, floppy disks, and um, play all the games for, all the games that I could with kind of cheap stuff there. And but yeah, it was amazing, right? So actually, oddly enough, one of the guys I met at a computer show kind of helped me build my first PC. Ended up later getting into IT consulting with him. So kind of right out of high school, I worked while I was in college. Worked as a kind of a network consultant for some small businesses. Um, Ended up kind of transitioning, worked for IT in banking, kind of managed an IT team there. And while I was there, I was like, it was a small commercial bank, a Taiwanese bank. I was one of the only kind of native English speakers. So they were like, hey, write our policies. And so I started writing, IT policies and then getting involved in compliance policies and stuff like that. And oddly, I wrote all these IT policies and then they would send them out to a law firm who had no idea like what, technology was. And so I had an ego and I was like, what the hell is this? Like they're redrafting my policies without any knowledge. And I thought what the world needs are more lawyers. And so but in that sense, wanted to be a lawyer who actually knew technology. So while I was working, went to law school, really with the intent of coming out and kind of growing in my IT career, really focusing on the security and regulatory side. So, in the early 2000s, we saw a whole bunch of like new regulation in banking and in healthcare, largely driven around privacy and cybersecurity. So, especially out here in California, I'm in California, so a lot of regulation there. And I thought, well, that's kind of the new frontier, right, in IT and security. And so I'll be really well prepared for that. Came out of law school in like 2009. The legal market had just tanked. The entire economy had just tanked, and uh, really didn't have much of an option to go directly into law, anyway, because I was competing with like 5 to 10 year associates who were out of work. And so stayed in IT, which was, like I said, kind of my original intent, and just kind of chipped away at it, and ended up, now kind of being in an executive level cybersecurity position in consulting, helping organizations, kind of along the way, build their security programs. Really have an emphasis on kind of like financial services, healthcare, kind of where they kind of make the alphabet soup of compliance and regulation. And then, obviously I have a background in incident response, helping organizations with kind of breach preparedness, as well as kind of the follow up to that. So yeah, I'd say it's helped me immensely. I think one of the things that law school does is kind of train your brain and in thinking critically about certain things, and so um, while I may not be in the courtroom, it's certainly been valuable to me in terms of not only like the actual like legal knowledge, but also the underlying kind of thought process.
That's fascinating. So actually, recently I'm actually just about to finish my second master's, which is an MBA. And before I went down that road, my initial thought process was very similar to yours. I saw the increasing regulation, and so I actually was planning on doing law school. I took the LSAT, which absolutely brutal. And then I ran into a problem where it was really challenging to find something that had the ability to do any level of remote law school that was also worked with my veterans benefits, and I was able to do part-time as well. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of remote part-time options in any law schools. And so I'm curious, how did you balance that were you working while doing law school as well?
I was working full time. I was married. My wife was going to med school. I was in law school. I think we saw each other for about like 30 minutes a day. Maybe it was interesting. I didn't get a lot of sleep at the time, and you're right. I mean, I think there are like very few programs. There are a lot more programs out there. It's interesting when you start getting into like the ABA, the American Bar Association. They limit the number of law schools. Um, you might say, like purposely. And then there are state bar associations as well. So there might be state accredited law schools, but you could only practice in that state. And so I ran into a couple of options there as well, where I was like, well, I'm gonna go to this law school, and then I was like, well, I'm eventually gonna get out of California. That was kind of my thought, and I was like, well, shoot, I won't be able to practice, or I'll have to go and go jump through additional hoops. Um, and so I did find a law school here. The other thing that's that people run into a lot is that they go to these other law schools, and there may not be a problem with the law school. Um, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but if you look at bar pass rates, um, the actual ABA approved law schools have a much higher bar pass rate than other schools. So I went to Loyola Law School here in Los Angeles, and I think the first time bar pass rate was about 85%, whereas the statewide bar pass rate was under 50%. And so when you start looking at like why that is, I think the school, has a part to play in that. And it is hard, like going remotely. Are you getting the right level of instruction? You know what I mean? Like that works for some, it doesn't work for others. And obviously that's going to, impact things like bar pass rate and whatnot. Right.
Well, for the record, I have never had any desire to be a lawyer.
Good for you. Good for you.
As Kyle said, what the world needs is more lawyers, right?
Well, I mean, you got Hutch over here going, yeah, I'm thinking lawyer, and me, and I'm just sitting here listening to the both of you going, you guys are looking at law, and I'm looking at crime.
Yeah. It does pay apparently. I tell everybody, like, my wife's a physician. I tell everybody to go that route. I think it's a noble thing. I mean, the legal profession can be, great. But for a lot of people, unfortunately, it's not very lucrative, right? You really have to find a niche because there are so many attorneys out there, that, there are a lot of them who don't make a ton of money, who aren't able to do the things that they want to do. So you end up finding a bunch of people who end up leaving the profession and doing something else, which the good news is it's a very versatile skill set. Like I said, it teaches you a new way to think, that I think has a lot of crossover into other areas, but you spend a bunch of money and a lot of people unfortunately don't recoup that. So not an area that I necessarily recommend a lot of folks to go into.
See, but the nice thing is I've claimed as being an X1 percenter. Most bikers are very, very close to paralegals because it's like we know how to dance almost up to that line. See, but you know exactly where the line is. We have to assume. So I mean that, plus the idea that I can see where somebody like you would have a major part to play in large organizations in terms of, like you said, around regulatory, and the idea that you don't have to go to external outside counsel to try and get a lot of that information, I think would be a major benefit. And I wish there was more people around like you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. There is obviously the ideas, the preconceived notions about IT people, about security people, right? Like I always tell folks, it's they think of you as the kid drinking Mountain Dew in your mom's basement kind of thing, playing video games or whatever, right? I mean, we have these stereotypes in the industry. And one of the things that I think, is commendable about, what you guys have done is, you're out here kind of talking about, all of these things, making people understand that people in security, people in IT know a whole lot more about, these things than they might, realize. And Hutch, getting your MBA, I think it helps bridge the gap between kind of the executive teams, and kind of the frontline teams, right? And I think that's always been helpful, for me, right? CEOs that I've worked with, really appreciate that. They kind of understand on at face value, kind of that I know more than, zeros and ones. And I think it really is important as IT professionals and as security professionals to not just focus on again, the zeros and ones, but also what the business impact is. And sometimes, it is a degree. Other times it's, how eloquent you are, or, just things of that nature, but certainly it's helpful.
for sure. And I think everybody's unique background contributes in a way to the unique value that they provide. But that being said, I guess circling back to really the topic of interest today. So again, all of the copyright issues, fair use issues that we're seeing. I'm curious if you can just speak to, from your perspective, where you see that intersection between law, specifically in the context of like copyright and fair use, and kind of just illuminate what those are.
And before you answer, for those of you who are just getting into this, you may not have heard that Justin and I both got screwed. So, for those of you who have gone out and bought mine and Justin's book, thank you very, very much from both of us. We appreciate that. And to all of the AI and large language models that have now ingested our books, this is a family show, so I'm not going to be raising middle fingers and telling OpenAI and Google and Microsoft exactly what I think of them taking my book. And I will close and hand this back to Kyle with saying, this is, in my opinion, karmatic payback for all of those songs I downloaded on Napster and LimeWire back in the day.
All of the songs you may have downloaded back in the day. Yeah.
Well, at this point, if there's still logs, come get me. I know, because I honestly feel like Lars Ulrich during the Napster thing right now, where I need to go after some young kid for downloading my book and trying to become a cyborg.
I'm curious, Kyle, since you mentioned, like obviously you modified with Risk language there. How much of that, I would imagine anytime you're creating documents, that is going through your head heavily. But how much do you actually regulate your speech and have these voices in the background of like, use careful?
Hutch, he said it changed his entire way of looking at the world.
It really does. It really does. Yeah, it really does. I mean, I find myself, and in fact, some of this was law school, but I took I think it was a SANS course years back, and the instructor kind of drove it home. He was talking about like policy development and stuff like that, and he was like, what he said resonated with me. It was like far too many organizations draft policies, and they're like, "Thou shalt not," right? That kind of thing, and it's like, all you're doing is you're setting yourself up for a contract dispute, right? Like, if you look at your policies as like, and even just in your normal discourse, the things you say or the things you commit to is a contract, right? Like, and when you're in law school, you realize that contracts are not just things you sign. It's a meeting of the minds, right? It's an offer, acceptance, and consideration, something that's given, right? To kind of solidify that. And so, by the way, that just like came back to me. Like it's just, elements of things kind of like just come back based on 4 years of evening law school. But you think about these things, you're like, well, I don't want to be in breach of contract. So I'm going to change the way I talk. I'm going to change the way I write, right? So when I draft a policy, I'm not going to say we must, because there are lots of cases where we won't. So, we should strive to, right? Those types of things, right? We have to like change our language so that we make sure that we kind of set lower expectations, right? And we can exceed those. That's fine. But I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver in any respect, because in my mind, that's always going to be a breach of contract, right? So certainly does change the way we think.
I do have one question, and this is a little off topic, but on topic. Do you feel that we've actually moved the needle of what we have to do for the understanding of the masses over time? Because I mean, the first thing that jumped in my head when, as you were talking, was that lady that wound up spilling the hot coffee on herself from McDonald's, and now we have the caution coffee is hot. Do you, from a legal perspective, do you think that it's that we are becoming dumber as a society, or is it that we're becoming smarter in terms of finding ways to litigate?
That's like a really big question, Len. I mean, I think like, there are a lot of ways. I mean, that case is an interesting one, because like what you hear about in kind of like the headlines and whatnot, it's become a joke. Like, oh my God, who didn't know their coffee was hot, right? You idiot, and you look at the details and you're like, oh no, it was like boiling water and the lid wasn't on. And like all these things, you're going, wait a second. Well, maybe there are like, like things that they could have done better. And oh, maybe when they asked them to pay for some medical bills, they should have just said yes instead of giving them the finger and causing this like, oh, well, that if you're not going to do that, I'm going to go here, right? So I think it stems from a lot of things. Number one, I do think that like there is this like societal like need for us to be protected, right? Like individually, like when you're wronged, like you feel like it's somebody else's fault instead of like saying like, well, gosh, like if it's then therefore I'm owed something. Like there's this like retribution also, right? So when something like that happens, it's like, well, I mean, the thing was on the floor and I slipped on it. Well, yeah, I mean, but you've got eyes. Like, what is somebody like going to walk in front of you and like clean the floor at all times? Probably not, right? So we need to take some accountability there.
Right, and that was going to be my point that I was about to make, because Hutch and I talk quite a bit on this show about the fact that especially when it comes to tech and personal security, there comes a point of personal responsibility for your own actions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there certainly is like I think there's a need for individual accountability, right, and responsibility, and we've got to own that. I also think that again there are rules to the road, right? Like that we all need to follow, and we need to expect others to follow those rules as well. And when they don't, yeah, we want to make sure that there's some system there to kind of you know catch that and protect us, right? But we also need to maybe have that like mindset, like if you're driving in a parking lot, right? Like I'm not just gonna say, well, I've got the right of way, so I'm gonna drive regardless. I've got to practice defensive driving as well, right? So we need to look out for the irresponsible people out there and understand that yeah, people are going to be irresponsible, right? There's going to be stuff on the floor that I can slip on, so I've got to have that level of individual accountability. I think that it's like all things, there's a pendulum in society, and I think we can like all of a sudden react to things societally and like shift way too far in the other direction where we almost abdicate that individual responsibility and expect someone to go ahead and like care for us and look out for us, right? They're going to point out that there's something there to slip on. It's not our responsibility, and if I do slip on it, well, gosh, it must be their fault, right? And so I think it's a pendulum, and we'll someday bounce back.
Yeah, but to your point, I see that same methodology a lot around breaches and post-breach conversations. Oh, it wasn't my fault. The control that we had in place didn't detect this, whatever, and it just seems to always go back into this strange gray area of finger pointing.
Yeah, and I don't know that really will ever change. I mean, at the end of the day, somebody's holding a bag and nobody wants to hold it. It's a hot potato, right? Like, and so no one's going to want to take ownership of that. You very rarely see anybody say, "Yeah, we messed up," right? We see this a lot where it's almost like, well, there was nothing we could have done. It was a nation state, or and you see that, right? It's almost like a force majeure kind of thing. It's like, well, there's nothing we could have done. It was an act of God kind of thing, right? It's like, well, okay, I mean, but did you do all the things you probably should have done, right? Like you could have minimized some of that, right? Maybe the thing would have happened, right? But if I built my house out of brick, sure, it might be damaged, but maybe not catastrophically so, right? Whereas if I build it with twigs and I have a tornado, well, yeah, it's 100% gone, right? Which one's better, right? You've got to have, and there is this concept in the law of like, you have a duty to mitigate your own damages, right? Like, and so I think that the law in it, like at its core, actually incentivizes that. Now, whether or not we kind of accept that, I think is up to us individually and societally. And again, I think like when you put it in the context of kind of cybersecurity and breach and response, I think most companies out there are trying to pass the buck, right? And I think that there's a perception, like a marketing side of that. Even when you think about like, well, gosh, like if you acknowledge that you did something wrong, is your cyber liability insurance provider gonna say, wait, you didn't do that, but you said when you applied that you did, and all of a sudden it's like, well, we're not going to pay out. So you've got to. There's this gamesmanship, I think, publicly that happens, and you saw with like SolarWinds, there's also like an internal dialogue that occurs, right? And that's oftentimes very different than the public messaging that's out there. And I think you're always going to see that. I mean, again, I think we do not really like incentivize people to take ownership, right? Like we're going to reward people for almost saying the right things, right? And say, oh, well, then if it's not your fault, well, then I'll punish somebody else, right? And so until we kind of move past that and align responsibility where it really belongs, and then again incentivize, for example, a corollary would be like, in the law, there's this concept of like, if we're in an accident and I offer to pay for your medical bills, you can't use that against me to like say, oh, well, then it must have been his fault. He offered to pay medical bills. Because we say, well, no, I mean, we're not going to allow that to be used against the person. They're trying to do something nice. We want to encourage that, right? But when you get to like cybersecurity, like in breaches, for example, you don't like incentivize like good behavior, right? On the post breach side, you don't incentivize somebody like owning up, right? It's only downhill from there, right? You're only going to have like negative repercussions, right? And so we really incentivize people from like hiding the ball.
So speaking of legal gray areas, and I'm really stretching here to find a good transition to meander us back, but
good segue.
Yeah. So
transaction slide.
Yeah, circling back to kind of the high level of really why we're here, which is the copyright and fair use. I guess I'll just open it up and let you speak freely as kind of what your perspective is to kind of what those are, but also how that is influencing what's happening in big tech right now.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's not influencing what's going on in big tech. I think the tech companies have latched on to, a path, right? They've gotten themselves onto a path. They've latched onto this technology that's, the train going down the tracks, and they're going to keep going regardless, right? And so when you look at like copyright and fair use, the copyright law is there to some extent protect the creator, right? And incentivize new creation, right? While at the same time, the kind of other side to that coin is fair use, because we want to make sure that we have the ability to leverage what was created before to create transformative thought, right? And new creations, right? It's like no one really stands on their own, right? They build on top of what has been built before. And so when we think about copyright laws, you think about all the things that are being, that have been created. And isn't it amazing that we can now query those things, and that we can even leverage GPT to go ahead and create new thought, right? To some extent, based on, the amalgamation of all of those things that have come before. And isn't that great? I can do that. It's wonderful. I can go ahead and ask, what did Hutch write in his book, right? That's amazing. It's a great feature. While at the same time, we're basically disincentivizing creation now, right?
Well, if I can throw something else in there, Justin and I did, after we had decided, and I'd love to get your take on this, after we decided or discovered that our books had been ingested, just for fun, and we're gonna put this up for anybody that's watching the video. I went into ChatGPT and said, write me a paragraph in the style of Len No about herding peacocks. I just wanted something crazy, and heck, if you give me just 1 second here, I want to pull this up, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read enough of it so that people kind of get an idea of exactly how close this stuff matched me and Justin, because it was absolutely terrifying. So I said, give me, in Len. So I'm just going to read you the first paragraph. Herding peafowl ain't like running a crew. It's more like dealing with a room full of hackers at DEF CON, unpredictable, stubborn, and just smart enough to make your life hell if you're not paying attention. So then I said, I asked the same question, and I said, write it in the style of Justin Hutchins. Herding peafowl is an exercise in controlled chaos, much like managing a live security incident. They operate on their own logic, easily startled, and frustratingly independent, yet patterns emerge if you observe them closely. It tied our exact styles of speech to the point where when we shipped
and
the
our
thing
and our
off,
backgrounds.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
it included a lot of references to my previous life in the motorcycle clubs, and there's one thing in terms of fair use to promote new ideas, but now somebody can actually not just take our ideas, but they can take our styles, our speech patterns, and everything else.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I mean, the reality though is that, like, I mean, I guess the other argument is that I could do that too. It would just take me a lot longer, right? I could read all of your books and blog posts and everything else and try to copy that, right? And I
And
could
and
never,
if
and so
you
long as
did
I'm
that, I
saying
wouldn't have.
something new,
As long as it was you doing that, that's fine. That's one person that's investing
yeah,
research. But the difference is now this is something that is available en masse.
yeah. And that is I think the bigger challenge. And I mean, I think you hit that, like, on the head, right? Like, when you look at fair use too, right? One of the things that fair use really talks about is, like, what is the impact on the market value, right? I mean, and we can go back, for example, even to call it like early 2000s, I think, when Google was ingesting books for searching, like, the world, like creating the world's digital library, right? There was a lot of concern. They're like, hey, you're taking all these books and you're ingesting them and then you're making them searchable. And Google's intent at the time, at least publicly, like what they were saying, is that they were just going to allow like excerpts to be made available. I think they were going to end up trying to digitize them and make and like sell books like akin to like a Kindle library or something like that. But that went to court too, right? Saying, hey, like, you're copying my books. Like, this is on its face like a copy of what I've done. That's a reproduction. You're breaking license agreements, right? Even if you had rights to access the book, which I think, we can get into, but even if they had lawful rights to access the book, did they have lawful rights to reproduce it? And the answer is no. But the court sided with them, and they sided with them because they said, well, what they're doing is they're creating a new use for this, right? You now have the ability to research that, and it's making it easier. But one of the things that they also said was, well, so long as they can't like make the book, like someone can't get the book directly from them for free, well, then what's the harm? They're not adversely impacting the market value of the work itself. You still have to go buy the work. And in fact, you could argue that by being able to easily find it and find the content and only being able to get an excerpt, I'm more incentivized as a consumer to buy the book, right? But if you change that now to what AI is doing, I don't really even need to read the book. I could just say summarize, Len's book, right? Like, and it just summarizes it for me. So do I really need it? Hell, I could even say, like, give me a quote from Len, and it might be able to do that. One of the things that I've always struggled with is access to the works, right? So, I mean, even before like copyright, right? Like, because, copyright is like your reproduction and or use of the material, right? But like, look at access. How did these companies get access to all of this data? Now, you could look at Google and say, look, I'm just like pointing you to something, right? I'm not giving you anything, right? All I'm giving you is an address, right? And in that sense, like, Google's just, I mean, they're just connecting dots. Like, you could argue like they're not really doing anything. Obviously, when they started copying the book and making it available, that's a different story. But like, if I Googled, for example, like torrent, Len's book, right? You know what I mean? Like, so, but if Google said, hey, well, here's a torrent file, go ahead and download the PDF, like, that's all on the hoster's side. Google isn't really like involved in that in the same way that like your internet provider isn't responsible for what you do with that access. But when you think about AI now, all of a sudden it's like, well, okay, but they ingested this material and they are actually making it available, right? So how did they access it? Did they access it like legally? Even from a training perspective, did they access it? Like, did they have a right to read it? Like, for example, I've got to buy your book to read it. If I didn't buy your book to read it, well, then how did I get it? Well, I must have gotten it from a library, or I got it from some other lawful source that also had to have a license to make it available to me, right? So some of the content providers, right, like the publishing houses are entering into agreements where the AI providers are licensing that underlying material. And that'll solve some of the challenges. But to your point, like they're also getting a lot of this data from pirated sources as well. And they're kind of leaning on like, well, I mean, it's there on the internet. Like it's available for me to look at. You can't sue me for looking at it. And you're like, well, but can I? You know, like I mean, I think I might be able to.
You know, and I know I'm monopolizing a lot of this conversation. I should let Hutch get in here at some point. But from a legal perspective, if we take this out of the technical realm and move it into the physical realm, you know, and let's say I have a bunch of stolen materials, and let's use industrial espionage as a better example. Let's say I have access to certain documents that would be beneficial to someone else. I can be charged with industrial espionage. I could be charged with trafficking in stolen goods. Why isn't, you know, to your point, the last point you just made, let's say that there's some illegal torrent out there, you know, that has a bunch of pirated books, movies, music, whatever you want to call it. But I mean, if we were in a physical situation where I had a physical piece of something, then I can be arrested for possession of stolen goods. Why do these same principles not transfer from the physical realm into the digital?
That's a really big question also. And I don't know that I have the right answer for that. I think the thing that I'm seeing kind of in various arguments is that when you start getting into like the access issues, it becomes a licensing problem. And then they're like, well, are you making it available? Right? Or are you just accessing what's out there on the internet? Like, and so for example, if what you're doing, and I think where you could go is like, and again, if in the Google context, I'm just pointing somebody to it, I'm doing nothing wrong, right? In you know, they can point to that. In an AI perspective, you can start going, well, okay, like if I'm pointing you to a URL where you can get the PDF, again, I'm just connecting you to a dot. I'm providing you information. By the way, the URL is not copyrighted. So all I'm doing is giving you access to that, right? I'm maybe Napster, right? But I'm not the host of the file who's like making it available illegally. I'm facilitating. But where I think you get into like really like uncharted territory is when you start saying, look, but I read it illegally. I like am basically providing back content like that's either the same or dramatically the same illegally. And I'm also basically making the market for that end data, like or maybe for that source data, like basically zero, because you don't have to go buy the book anymore. Number one, because you're pointing me to it, but also because I don't even have to read it legally or illegally, right? I can just ask you to summarize it and I can get it. So, but where a lot of, I think the providers are focusing is they're like, yeah, access issues. Don't worry about that, right? What they're saying is, I've got transformative technology, and I'm not giving people away like the underlying source data. What I'm doing is I'm allowing people to use it differently. And so like they're sidestepping the issue altogether, right? So they're not talking about access really any longer. I think the court cases that are going through right now, like definitely are looking at access issues, because they're like, you know, the Times is suing OpenAI and others, saying like, hey, how'd you get my data? Right? You didn't pay me for that data. And if you want to use it going forward, you got to license it. And so I think, I think there are some cases going through right now that will settle that. But I also think that they're going to be most likely settled pretty like narrowly. And because I think the courts are going to be really afraid of like making like legal decisions and setting like a broader precedent here, because that could stifle the technology. And I think they're really afraid of doing that. And I would argue the same thing about back in the Google story 20 years ago, right? Were they really willing to fight Google even at that time? Well, hell, Google's like only gotten bigger. So are they really going to fight Google or OpenAI today, who are worth billions of dollars, you know, like trillions combined? And everyone is looking at them to use them. And are they going to stifle that technology by saying, hey, you can't use that underlying data? No. I think what they're going to do is they're going to find a way within the existing kind of elements of the fair use doctrine to say, hey, like this is fair use, but oh, by the way, for these maybe identified sources, you need to have a licensing agreement. But again, I think like, and that's only going to be for like commercial use, because what does Meta do with Llama 4? They make it available. Well, they trained it, but they're making it available for free. Well, how do you take an open source product like that, right? And say, oh, you content producer have to pay, or not content producer, but Meta in this case, yeah, you're making something available for free, but let me, or we're going to make you pay for the underlying source data. We're going to run into a lot of challenges with that, because it's going to kill the market for LLMs and the creation there. And I think the other thing too is like, we oftentimes think about this in terms of our nation state borders, right? But anytime you're talking about LLMs, you're like, well, it's like OpenAI versus, DeepSeek and, ByteDance and whatever. And you're like, well, okay, the rules that our courts set are only really going to be enforceable here or where we have a treaty in place. What are the other countries doing? In some ways, I think like, China has more restrictive copyright rules, or at least are more willing to enforce them in some cases. In fact, I think there was a case where a particular like image or 3D image was created using one of the tools, and they said, well, you need a license for that, for creating that image. And it's like, cool, I applaud your enforcement of that. I don't know that is representative of the Chinese government like overarching like desire to enforce copyright laws. Like, so I think we're going to have a lot of these challenges where the courts, in my opinion, in the US are probably going to like acquiesce and allow a lot like broader use of the underlying data for fear of stifling the technology. And that's, in fairness to them, that is kind of baked into fair use, right? Fair use is saying, look, if it's for the greater good, right? I'm paraphrasing, then maybe we should allow it. And I think that the jury's out, if you will, as to whether or not it's for the greater good. I think the other thing is, what's the alternative? Again, it's like you could make OpenAI go ahead and pay for all these licensing agreements, but are you going to make the Chinese companies do the same thing? And if you wanted to, how would you enforce it? It just becomes a challenge.
Have either of you guys seen the TV show on Netflix, Super Pumped, or the miniseries, I guess?
No.
So
I have not.
Fantastic. I absolutely recommend it. But it is about the early stages of Uber and their Silicon Valley roots and everything. And the reason that I bring it up is it is fascinating because it paints this picture of a company that very deliberately violated all kinds of laws and regulation at the time, with this idea of we're contributing to the greater good. And it largely became baked into the culture of Uber, of basically regulatory fines, some of the legal hurdles that we run into. That is the cost of doing business. We don't care. We're not even going to try to comply with them because it's going to stifle us so much that we're going to be full steam ahead. There will be costs, there will be penalties, but it's completely disregarded. And I feel like that's a story that we've seen time and again in Silicon Valley. And I think there's fascinating parallels here between what we're seeing in the AI space, where it's almost easier to beg for forgiveness after the fact than ask for permission.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, and I think you've already seen that, right? I mean, they didn't ask for permission to ingest the data, right? And they just figured, well, if they fine us, they fine us. We're worth more money. We'll go ahead and just raise more, more capital and pay the fines, right? Like, this isn't a big deal, And frankly, I think it absolutely works in their favor. If they had fought this battle even 5 years ago, when no one was using it, like, this would be a very different discussion. But at this point, it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It's the cat that the courts are not going to be able to put back in the bag. And as a result, they're not going to try. They're going to, if anything, they will, in my opinion, they will find these very narrow, rulings to go ahead and get person X what they needed because they were wronged. And then, they won't accept any other cases, kind of thing, right? In that area. And they'll be very careful not to set precedent that's gonna stifle this, because there just is no way, I think, at this point, um, to really do that. I think the only thing that we can do is kind of wait for, honestly, more like legislation to come out relative to that. And even then, I mean, I think the U.S. legislators are not, in my opinion, very willing to kind of limit the AI, creators, if you will, the big tech companies. In the EU, we see a different story, right? They definitely are willing to go ahead and set limits. The challenge there is that, number one, they're not very big, tech companies there in this space, and I would argue for that reason. Um, and I think too, like a lot of the regulation you see there, even in privacy, like GDPR, it's very well intentioned. It's not very like realistic, right? Like it's very hard to comply with. Most organizations maybe make a best effort, right? And what it does do is it allows, to your point, Hutch, it allows maybe like the regulators there to find these companies and say, look at us, we've done our job, we're protecting the little guy, we collected a $20 million fine. Cool. Google pays the $20 million fine, goes back to business, right? It didn't stop anything, right? And I think that's where I think we're going to keep seeing, the market go until it basically goes away, because we all just kind of accept it, right? We just go, oh, well, they've already got all the data. Like, what are we going to do?
And that's the one point that I see as kind of like an overwhelming theme against all of this is, as a society, we just got to suck it up and say this is the new normal.
I was just going to say, I do think that it does say something troubling, and I guess about the entire concept of the rule of law, when one regulation does become just a cost of doing business and completely disregarded. And of course, there's other companies that won't disregard it and won't be successful for that reason, or blow up the same way that ones that do are willing to accept that risk. So I think there's that, but I think there's also this challenge of, you mentioned that we're going to have to wait for legislation to catch up and not rely on so much on precedent and others. I think we are increasingly seeing our political system, especially here in the United States, become so polarized that nothing gets done. When it does, it's at a very slow pace. Not to mention the geopolitical incentives that you mentioned to try to stay away from stifling innovation anyways. And I think all of that kind of comes together to a situation where I think you've got technology that's moving faster, legislation and regulation that's moving slower and slower year over year. And I do think it puts us in this situation where we are exposed to risk that we're just not equipped to address, that is consistently emerging. And
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think when you think about, like in banking, right? We all, heard the term kind of too big to fail. I would almost say like tech companies are almost too big to regulate. Like they run everything. We are more like embedded in the big tech companies than we are in kind of our own legal fabric, right? Like, so, and at the same time, I mean, I always tell people, it's like, when you saw a breach at like Home Depot, right? It was, oh my God, we got breached at Home Depot. My credit card data is, I'm not going to shop at Home Depot. And then 2 weeks later, people are shopping at Home Depot. And the same thing happened at Target, right? It's like we have very short memories, and we also, as a society, choose like ease, right? Like over complexity. And it's very easy to get into the Google ecosystem or the Amazon ecosystem or the Microsoft ecosystem. And it's easy to use these, tools like ChatGPT, right? And so we like that. And we're going to keep doing it. And so do we really want them to be regulated? I would say as a whole, we don't, right? Now, when you ask people, do we want creators to be, rewarded for their stuff? We say, yeah, I do. But then how to do that? It's like, well, I don't know. And it gets hard. So let me just go back to use ChatGPT, and I won't think about that. So
the one thing I'm going to throw out here is the fact that we're essentially breaking the rule of law between physical and digital. The same, if justice is supposed to be blind and the idea of theft is theft, to your point, we're more beholden to the tech companies, if this is the new norm and this is the way that we are, I mean, what does that say to the rule of law in general? That if it's in tech, it's allowed, but if I do the same thing physically, it's a crime.
Well, I mean, I would argue there are some parallels, right? So, for example, you know, if I go to ChatGPT and I say, write me this like thing, in Len's voice kind of thing, right? They could argue that's parody, and it's just like the Weird Al of AI, right? Like, you know what I mean? They're just like giving you something that you, as the consumer, knowingly like asked for, and they're going to say that's really parody anyway. And then on top of that, if
The Weird Al thing, very interesting kind of comparison. I'm curious, and I don't know if you know the background here, but I imagine he probably dealt with some lawsuits in
Oh,
regards.
he dealt with a ton
Yeah.
of lawsuits.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was actually like the foreground of a lot of like fair use doctrine in terms of like what parody could do, right? I mean, you're literally stealing like the the melodies, from a song, right?
Should we clarify for our possible Gen Z
They're like,
viewers?
who the hell is it? Weird Al.
Curly
It's
hair
my uncle.
accordion would basically take existing songs and then, of course, put his own lyrics to them. But
The king of parody satire music.
I know it's a sad day when you have to like explain that. But here we are. But I mean, I think so. So on the one hand, right, there are cases in copyright law that certainly allow the reproduction, the copying, and in fact, like the court said, look, like Google's use of like or intent to make the books available and searchable is so transformative that it is worthwhile to us to go ahead and like allow the full reproduction of the book, right? Not just excerpts or whatever, which would historically be like you can quote like your book in the New York Times, right? Well, like, well, okay, but I'm not giving the whole thing away. But that's not, they deemed basically as transformative. That like one review is not as transformative of a use as Google's searching capability, where, hey, I want you to be able to search the entire thing. And that's so transformative, we're going to allow it. There are other like, look at like a library, right? I mean, they make the books available right now. I mean, so to some extent, don't we want the books available? Look at Cliff's Notes, right? Like when I was in high school, I was reading Cliff's Notes because I was too lazy to read the book. You know what I mean? So, we have a synopsis like option available. So I think it's very easy to say, oh gosh, like they're making all these things available. I would argue it's just today's version of some of that. Like if I had to make that argument for them. I think though too, what's happening is that technology has made our lives so much easier. It's also made these things so much easier. And that ease of accessing it, that ease of finding it makes it really like almost very different than in the physical world. So it's very similar in some ways in terms of like operationally, like what are we doing? Oh, I'm going to get the Cliffs Notes version. Okay. Did I buy the book? No, I just bought the Cliffs Notes. So did the producer get paid on that? No. Okay. But we still allowed it because it was a transformative use. Okay, well now I don't even need to buy the Cliffs Notes version. I just asked ChatGPT and I'm getting the same style of content and nobody's getting paid for it. So is it transformative enough? Is that use transformative enough for us to say, but it's worth it? To kind of almost to some extent like eliminate the market for the original content. I don't know. I think those are questions that are still unanswered, but I would argue that it goes back to what we talked about earlier. Like, is any court really going to say, hey, stop training your LLMs on this? Like, could they even do that? You know what I mean? Like, I don't think they could at this point, like technically. So,
well, I guess my overall takeaway from this conversation is there are questions, there's some troubling things that are happening, but at the end of the day, nobody's stopping this train.
I don't see the train stopping. I think the consumers have spoken. When you have, what was it, like 100 million users in 5 days or something originally with ChatGPT, and now what did Sam Altman say the other day? I think that they had like 100 million users in like 4 hours, like sign up for ChatGPT when the new, I think, image generation came up, right? So I think the consumers have spoken, and in some case, right, doesn't that signify that this is certainly a transformative use and that the world wants it? I think the next thing that we're going to have to deal with is the fallout. Like, how do we operate in this new paradigm where, as creators, you want to create, but kind of why? Like, why should you? Right? I could just say, let's write a book, in the voice of Len. Let's, and at the same time, even if you wanted to go ahead and do it, you wanted to fight that battle, you write your book. Is there a market for it? Are you going to be able to sell it? Is your publisher going to want to pay you for that when they're like, yeah, no one's going to buy it? Like, I'm going to produce it, make it available. OpenAI is going to ingest it, and voila, everyone's got the content. Like it eliminates a market, and I think we're going to have to figure out how we do that going forward.
All right. Well, good stuff. Anything else from you, Lynn?
Well, I do have to ask him the one question I've decided to ask every single guest from now on. In closing, what was your first Linux distro?
Gosh, my first. I think Fedora. Well, CentOS actually on the server side, and Fedora on the.
Rock on. I'm waiting for somebody to beat my Corel or Mandrake.
Well, yeah, going back for sure. Yeah, I mean, when I started, I was on like NT3.5 and Novell NetWare, and then we had to transition to Corel at one point. But
the double dot, and since he brought it up, Hutch also knows. I will say this anytime anyone ever brings up Novell, NDS was so much better than Active Directory.
A million times better. But alas, I don't think anybody liked the integration. So login was a pain in the ass.
True, and IPS XPX was never fun either. But for those of you who don't know what Novell is, go look in the Wayback Machine. You'll realize we're older than most of you, and if it wasn't for people like us playing with technologies like this, you wouldn't have AI.
You know what's wild is I actually did a pen test that was less than a decade ago, and they were still running Novell directory services. It was a financial institution too, so yeah, it was.
It's interesting how these things survive, but yeah, I've seen it too.
I was working at a very large financial institution, and they were still running COBOL.
I think there's quite a few that are still doing that.
Yeah, there was a lot of development against X series that was done in those, and like the idea of like redoing that is heart-wrenching for a lot of folks, so they just don't want to do it. So
all right, well, great stuff. Kyle, really appreciate you coming on. Yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation, really interesting, definitely eye-opening. So yeah,
we'd love to have you back again sometime.
Yeah, well, good. I haven't killed my reputation here on this podcast. All right, cool. All right. Hey, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Anything else, Hutch?
No, that's it. Over and out.
Cybercognition out.
This has been another episode of the Cybercognition podcast. If you enjoyed this show, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And check out other shows on the Cyber Circus Network for the best in cyber entertainment and the greatest show on Earth.